Question. Can you comment on the 144 levels of consciousness with regard to death and rebirth? When we re-embody, do we come back in at the same level of consciousness as we left in the previous embodiment? Or do we reincarnate higher or lower depending on other factors? Well, the answer is that it depends on what you do in between embodiments. And that depends on your level of consciousness that you had when you left your last embodiment. So there are people in the world who are in a very, very self-centered state of consciousness. And when they leave embodiment, they're not able to work with our spiritual teachers, the Ascended Masters. So I've explained in many videos that beyond the physical frequency spectrum, the physical energies, there are higher energies that are some of the emotional realm, some the mental, some the identity level. So many of these very, very selfish people, they go to the emotional realm. And in the emotional realm, there are other people that are also at a very selfish, self-centered state of consciousness. There are also beings who are like demons, or what I call fallen beings in my video about how the world was created. And so there are realms in the emotional realm that are kind of like a hell. Like Dante saw the 9 circles of hell, for example. That's levels of the emotional realm. So if a person is in a very selfish centered consciousness, it will attract itself to the realm where there are other people who are just as selfish as they are. And so there are 2 ways that this can go for a being like this. It can clash with these beings, fight them, and therefore it can actually reinforce its self-centered state of consciousness. Right? So, or it can have enough of fighting with these people and therefore raise its consciousness. So I have talked about in one of my breakthrough videos and several other videos that there are 144 possible levels of consciousness that we can be in on Earth. So let's say we have a person who is very self-centered, who is at, say, the 10th level of consciousness, fairly low. And that one then goes into the emotional realm. Now it starts fighting with other beings there, and it drops to the 8th level of consciousness. So then, if the being gets another opportunity to reincarnate, it will come in at the 8th level. It may also be that it has enough of this, and it raises to like the 15th level of consciousness. And then it obviously comes into an embodiment there. And so, when you come back into embodiment, you often gravitate to a family situation, a societal situation, where you have the same kind of selfish people. So let's say a very self-centered person might be reborn into some criminal family or gang somewhere, into some society where there's a lot of crime, for example. So that's one option. Then you can have people who are at a higher level of consciousness. They either go to a higher level of the emotional realm in between embodiments, or they go to the mental realm, for example. But again, the dynamic is the same. You can either lower your consciousness in between embodiments, or you can raise it. And that determines then what your level of consciousness among the 144 is, and that's the level you come into with your next embodiment. Now, then there are people who are above the 48th level of consciousness, and they have some sense of connection to the higher self and to our spiritual teachers, the Ascended Masters. So in between embodiments, they can work on their psychology, their unresolved psychology. This is what determines your level of consciousness among the 144, because the lower you go, the more illusions, the more of these subconscious selves that I talk about, you have taken on. So when you're above the 48th level, you have overcome enough of these that you have a sense of connection to your spiritual teachers. So depending on where you are, 48th, 78th, 96th, 120th, you go to either the mental realm or the identity realm, and you receive some help there from spiritual teachers. And so the purpose of this help is, of course, to help you raise your consciousness in between embodiments. And again, when you raise your consciousness, you come into embodiment at a higher level. Therefore, you will tend to gravitate to a situation that's more positive. It can be that you have a specific unresolved psychology that you want to overcome in your next embodiment. So you choose to embody in a lower situation because there are people there who will force you to look at that psychology. Like, just as an example, there are people who are at a fairly high level of consciousness who choose to embody in an abusive family, for example, with an abusive parent, sexually, emotionally, physically abusive, in order to overcome a particular subconscious self that they haven't overcome in past lifetimes. They are sort of forcing themselves to confront this issue. This is a fairly common scenario. There are also people who embody in a certain situation that's actually lower than their state of consciousness because they want to give other people an opportunity by interacting with them and seeing their reactions. So there are different scenarios that can come into play there when you are above the 48th level and you are on an upward spiritual path. But there can also be, of course, scenarios where it isn't so important what family situation or society you come into, because your potential is to become a person who brings forth a new idea in some area of society. So really, it isn't the situation you're born into that determines why you embody there. It's not like there's a psychology you necessarily need to resolve, but you just need to come into embodiment in some kind of society, like a free society where you have the opportunity to bring forth new ideas or inventions. So that's another sort of, in other words, there's a lot of different possibilities. But in general, as the question says, do we come back in at the same level of consciousness as we left? And I would say that in general, people don't. They either go lower or they go higher. Because if you have a very low level of consciousness and you embody in these very low levels of the emotional realm, it's hard to not fight. And so therefore people solidify and actually drop to a lower level of consciousness. And if you are on a positive track and you are willing to receive help from spiritual teachers, then you will tend to raise your consciousness. So I think most people will come higher or lower. Of course there are some that come in at the same level, but I think that's the exception rather than the rule. So again, do we reincarnate higher or lower depending on other factors? Yeah, the other factor is our willingness to grow. If we're not willing to go, we go lower. If we are willing to go, we go higher. But what does it mean we're willing to go? We are willing to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, how do I need to change? Why am I reacting this way? What is it in my psychology that needs to change? In other words, the determining factor on whether you're on upward track or downward track is really your willingness to look at yourself and realize there are outer situations that you are encountering. There are other people who are projecting things at you. But what affects you is not the outer situation, it's your inner reaction to it. And even if you can't change the other people and the outer situation, you can change your reaction. That is the, telltale sign. That's the turning point where you start a positive upward track when you realize if I can't change something outside of myself, it doesn't mean I'm powerless, because I can change my reaction to it, and that will actually improve my life. So that is, when you come to that realization, that's when you're on a positive track, and then you generally will come in higher because you will grow in between embodiments. So you come in at a higher level than your last embodiment.